Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is Don sitting in the host chair today. I'm glad to be sitting in the host chair. We've had a lot of sputs and starts and stops that have been trying to get back in the role of things, but I'm very happy to see four people that I like on the screen here. Five, I guess, if you count me, because I can see myself. So I have the full crew gathered here today for this episode. Working from my left to right, I've got EC Darling Bond, Eric. We're going to start calling him EC, though. We've decided just to do that to make it easier since he's adopted that. So, Eric, how you doing today? Or EC, how you doing today?
I'm feeling easy. I'm feeling great.
There you go. See Alexis there. It's good to have Lex on here. I know she's been busy with stuff going on too. Lex, how you doing this afternoon?
Pretty good, yeah. Life's been busy.
Life's been busy. That's a fair way to describe it. I've got Mr. Robert Koshu if this were the Hollywood Squares, you would almost be towards the middle, except you're in the middle bottom for me, Robert. So you're in the Paul Lynde seat. That's dating me a little bit there.
I like the Paul Lynde seat. Hello, everybody.
Hey, Robert. Or I guess if you're in the Brady Bunch seat, is it Alice that sits in the middle there? So if you know that,
it's always Alice.
Always Alice. This is what Zoom has done to us. We think Brady Bunch and Hollywood Squares. And there's Mr. Eric Rush. How are you today, Eric?
Doing very well, Don. Thank you.
Good to have everybody back here. So we're going to jump right into it here. And the topic is courtesy today of several folks who had suggested this, but mainly Mr. EC Darling Bond. So I'm going to let EC give us the background here. We're going to roll in as we always do with a little bit of the what did, and then we get to the fun part, which is trying to figure out what might have happened. So take it away, good sir.
All right. So I want you to put your mind into the 116 years war between England and France. And basically, it's the world's worst game of Stratego, where basically all of the noble families are competing, they say, for the throne of France, but no one ever seems to really commit to it. The Burgundians, a northern French cadet line of the Valois, have allied with the English, and the main branch of the Valois with Charles VII of France leading them. Things are not going well. Most of France has now been occupied by the French and the English. Well, by the Burgundians and the English. That's going to be hard to keep track of. But there is a prophecy, a legend of a maid who will save France, for a woman lost France, which is a connection to how Edward claimed that because of his French mother, he had a tie to the French throne. It's all very sexist, but we're going to jump in to 1429 on May 3rd. A young woman named Joan of Arc has come before the French king claiming to have visions, telling her that she must lead France's armies against the Burgundians and against the English. And at Orleans, she will make her stand. She shows up. She wants to immediately charge the embattlements of the Burgundians, but is told she has to wait because they need to get supplies. Now, in our timeline, they waited 5 days. A battle ended up happening, and Joan of Arc ended up throwing herself into the fray, but survived the battle only because Gilles de Rais, one of the first historical French serial killers and BFFs with Joan of Arc, was able to show up with the armaments and supplies they needed. You know the rest of the story. They continue on for a year. She wins 9 out of 13 battles, I want to say, against the Burgundian and English forces, and is eventually burned at the stake by the Burgundians and the English for heresy. She becomes a saint. Mark Twain writes a book that he thinks is good about her. Whole story. But what if she got to lead the battle a day earlier, on May 3rd? She is immediately killed. And now we're going to figure out what happens when the greatest threat to the Burgundian-English alliance is just automatically gone. In the words of I believe it's better off dead. I think you just need a little bit of success and you'll find that it suits you. Now with Joan of Arc gone, that line doesn't exist because the French love interest in that movie no longer speaks French. She speaks English, and we're going to find out why.
Actually, it's interesting you referenced that movie, EC, as my favorite line from that is $2, but that's neither here nor there.
$2 plus
you
two.
You owe me $2. All right. Yeah, young John Cusack. There you go. All right. So we all know that what happened in the real timeline, as was quickly summarized there, is that Joan's arrival changes the course of this long-standing battle and swings it back to where to French success when things were not looking well for the French. So I guess the first place that I want to go and throw out to the panel is the assumption being that if they go a day early, improperly supplied, all the reasons that are there, again, failure is what's going to take place, and that results in her death. So if the French don't win here, is it over for the French? Eventually, is there English and allied French forces that are in control? I guess, what's the big picture thoughts? Just going around really quick.
My thought is yes, because at this point, they've really been the French have been just kind of holding out for some kind of miracle to happen. The Burgundians and the English do not have as strong as an alliance as they appear from the outside to have. But to the French, especially to Philip, or is it Philip, or who is the Charles VII? To Charles VII, who we call the Victorious because he gets crowned King of England after the battle, because Joan of Arc tells him that's what the angels want for him. It adds this sense of legitimacy. But if this great hope, who she was prophesized and that they've put a lot of faith into, just dies automatically. And she had a number of close calls during the Battle of Orleans where she was saved personally by Gilles de Rais no less than 4 separate occasions. It becomes at worst, or at best, an embarrassment of like, hey, do you remember that time Charles got that weird witch to lead a battle on that encampment? To worst of, well, Charles is a heretic. He just believed this heretic of leading a battle. That's weird. Any thoughts? Gilles de Rais, richest man in Europe, and also later to be convicted of serial killing?
Well, not necessarily about that, but
Yeah.
I definitely think that if there was any number of ways that she could have died at the Battle of Orleans, and in many ways, I think it was more likely than not that she would have been. I almost feel like the actual history is less plausible than what could have happened. Is what the most likely set of scenarios are, honestly, that she died anonymous, in at the Battle of Orleans, and you have a fairly rudderless French force, that really didn't have, that had the Dauphin and was against, and I agree with you. You see that you had the Burgundians and the English, and they had the enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of alliance. I think they could have probably, I think at best they could have carved up the turkey had they, defeated France, but that's probably about it. There might have been some tension. I could have easily seen, the English being content with Brittany, Normandy, and Gascony, and the Burgundians taking the rest of what we now consider sort of northeastern France. But it definitely wasn't it wasn't a true alliance. But I think the victory at Orleans kind of opened up the door for the further Loire campaigns, which opened the door for further campaigns, which eventually ended up in with the crowning of Charles VII, which we usually call the Dauphin, which to me is a very interesting name for a crown prince. But that's my Anglophone ears.
Well, that's just because, the English love whales and the French love dolphins, Eric.
There you go. I mean, I guess I like whales and dolphins, and so I guess that's a thing.
2 things. One, I agree with both Erics. The alliance between the English and the Burgundians is not really an alliance; it's more of a toleration. It is very much that enemy of my enemy is my friend thing, where it's like we're just going to tolerate you because we like you marginally more than the people that we're fighting. And I think that the reason Joan of Arc is still talked about today is because of the outcome of the battle. If it goes differently, it's we're gonna sweep that under the rug and not talk about that time that we accidentally put all our hopes on a heretic. I don't think she becomes the figure that we know today. She would still be a part of it, but she doesn't become the figurehead and the saint if this goes differently.
To me, the thing that jumps out there, I'll readily admit, this is one of those parts of French English history that I sort of have difficulty keeping track of. There's too many Henrys. There's like 39 Henrys, I think, just in France alone, during the period of time for the next couple of years and all the stuff there. And again, it's a long war. To EC's point, we call it the 100 Years' War. We're shortchanging it by 16 years when we do that. It was a long time. It was multi-generational. But to me, it always just tells you how desperate things were for the French, that they're willing to let this untrained girl,
teenager. Untrained teenager.
Have any say at all on what they're going to do. That sort of gives you an idea of just how desperate the situation is, that it's come to this, and okay, maybe she is getting visions from God, and at this point, what almost is like we need to make sure we're properly supplied, but hey, what have we got to lose, kind of deal, which gives to me, that's just the whole indication of just how desperate the situation was.
So the first thought I have is, if this occurs in this timeline, Joan of Arc does not exist in our history.
Right.
At all. Like none. Like there is no mention of her at all. The English and the Burgundies definitely are victorious because Joan becomes a symbol of France at this point. And she becomes the symbol that moves everything forward into this day. The French revere, hold her in high esteem as the one who took on the bad English and did something with them. And I think the downstream effect is even bigger than the immediate effect with this.
Agreed.
I guess that was going to be my question is, I'm trying to imagine, Eric sort of divvied up how it might be divvied up in terms of, how the settlement would go down. In this alternate timeline, if we said France today, would there be anything that we would even think of as being modern France, or what would France be like? Now, a lot of stuff happens obviously between then and now. Obviously, there's tons that goes on, but I mean, what is the? I was going to say, for me, the interesting thing is, there's the immediate outcome here that would be different. We just talked about that. Maybe we can talk about that more. But what is the long term here? And I think the downstream is really interesting because, like it or not, France is a big landmass part of Europe, even when they're not powerful, just because it's larger. And so you pull France out and create a vacuum. What do you have?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Eric.
I think that, I think eventually Gascony goes back to what we consider France. I think culturally, I think it eventually goes back one way or the other. When we kind of get out of the medieval era into a more sort of early modern nation state era, that's not hard for me to envision, but similarly, I could easily see a kind of Normandy and Bretagne either being part of a kind of a greater British Empire, almost a kind of a, not quite the Angevin Empire, but not unlike the Angevin Empire. But sort of kind of maintaining some of that cultural similarity to Britain, whether politically or just culturally. And we may see a persistence of a Burgundian state, if not to the modern era, that at least a little bit longer. At least in sort of what we call the sort of the Franche-Comté, the Alsace-Lorraine, Grand Est, those sort of places that we would think of as being more Burgundian. That's not hard to see, at least for a while. I don't know how that ends up necessarily. And I think especially as if we kind of take this 400 years into the future, when we look for kind of the Prussian unification of what we eventually called the German state, would they look to a French state for security, or would they feel comfortable with being in their own nation statehood, as did Belgium and the Netherlands? I don't think we know that. But
so Eric, are you thinking, because I pulled up a map just because I was totally curious.
Yeah.
So are you thinking France becomes three pieces? So the northern part of France, Normandy, Port de Calais, those areas. Well, Calais doesn't end up there, but Normandy kind of end up in England. But then the eastern north part, which is like Flanders down into the Duchy of Burgundy, that all becomes Burgundy.
Exactly.
And then France is that little southern part. And I guess the only question I have is, does the Bordeaux region stay with France, or does it stay with England? And then at some point, do you end up having
Bordeaux stays with France?
You think Bordeaux stays with France? And then, so that's interesting, because now you've got now you have an England with a foothold on the continent and for an extended period of time, and an ally in that Burgundy kingdom at the same time. So that becomes even more intriguing as you come out of the 100 Years' War.
Well, and let's assume that everything stays the same as far as future succession, and you also have a Hanoverian dynasty in Great Britain, several hundred years in the future, which, I mean, my geography as an American is a little distorted, but when I think of Burgundy and Hanover, they, to me, that sounds like a kind of a nothing commute.
Yeah. The other thing that immediately jumped into my mind thinking about the timeline here, we're in 1429, so we're less than 100 years short of the Reformation. So Reformation being popping up at lots of places, and it certainly exists before this with Hus and some of the other other things that were going on that were there before Luther. But the Reformation at its core is very German. Luther and then very Swiss, and of course there's the nature of Switzerland being its connections to France linguistically and otherwise. But I'm trying to think through in my head, and I don't know the answer to this question. In fact, I know that it was in EC's notes. Is the Hussite Reformation what really becomes the Reformation as we know it because something else gets changed, or if there still is a Reformation without France playing the role that it was and being divided for much of its history when it came to what was going on with Protestants and Catholics as a counterbalance to Spain, all the things that are going on, because two things are about to happen in the next century. The age of exploration is really going to go to the next level with the New World, and then the Reformation coming along, and how are those the same or how are those different with Europe divided up in what we used to think of as France being three different kingdoms and playing together maybe differently.
So EC gave us some great notes about councilorism, which is basically, does the Pope control, or does an ecumenical council control the church at this point? So church history is actually one of my bigger pieces. And yeah, absolutely. This massively affects particularly what we refer to as the Council of Florence, which is where councilorism was actually thrown away in. And so that actually becomes, now we've got that. So in essence, there's not a pope for Luther to rail against. I think he's going to rail against the Catholic Church still, Don. But I do think ecumenical councils are going to become much more prevalent throughout time. So after the Nicene Council, now you've got the Council of Florence, and I think those become much more prominent over time. And so I think Rome loses some of its power in the midst of this as well.
Well, and the other thing I was just going here, and Alexis, I think, is probably more of our in-house expert on this than almost anyone. Start thinking about, we're talking about the Wars of the Roses that are also, I guess, still ahead, or in the middle of it, or we're still ahead to some degree in terms of figuring out where that's going to be. And so much of that was often the influence that France was trying to place on who was going to be seated on the English throne. Well, does that play out or work the same way?
Well, when I was reading through Easy's notes, a name stuck out immediately when you think War of the Roses. That would be Jacquetta of Luxembourg, because in the real timeline, she's the mother of this little person called Elizabeth Woodville, the future wife of Edward IV. So does this affect the 100 Years' War? 100%, yes, it affects the 100 Years' War.
Yeah, and then ultimately, how does that play out with, I guess, one of the things we've talked about a number of times before, because we tend to, we focused around this era of history a lot, is there was the disruption going on inside of England because of the War of the Roses, which kept it from being as organized as an outward power as you might have thought it would have been. When it becomes a Protestant nation, it becomes a Protestant nation. Yes, to some degree because of theology, but mostly because of politics and genders, and heirs. And so if you have a different England that is actually either a colonial, not colonial, continental power, or at least a continental presence, even if it's just through a client state type of arrangement, which is what it may have ultimately become by this point. The dynamics of what we know that were the dynamics between France and Spain and England and the Germany, in the sense of the Protestant Reformation, all of that gets tipped around a little bit. I don't know where it lands, but it gets tipped around a good bit.
Well, what I essentially was learning doing the research for this is that France and England are almost entirely in the same boat politically, just maybe past each other by 15 years apiece, to where they are both monarchies that are not explicitly nationalized yet. Like, we are before the age of lowercase n nationalism, to where everybody has a sense of like, oh yeah, we belong to this nation state, whereas we're in this period of like, oh no, this is just this guy's property. It's kind of like if you went to war with a different HOA over like property rights of like, well, I own that apartment block over there, and it's like, you don't own that apartment block, we own it.
It's a step up from feudalism.
It's a step up of feudalism, and we're also dealing with both monarchies that are in periods of regency for a lot of the war. Like, for the English right now, at the time of Joan of Arc, we have Henry VI, who is a wee child, his uncles John of Bedford and Humphrey of Gloucester, and his great uncle, who is a cardinal, but his name is escaping me, who was put in charge of the Hussite War and then promptly lost his division. Fun family, are essentially in charge of running the nation and running the war effort, and they are very committed to the idea of Henry V's dream of an English France. That is what they are all about. Humphrey especially is very well known and tried to kind of take over the Regency Council, but things just don't work out, especially when his second wife gets accused of necromancy. Weird time. And then Henry VI grows up, and he's kind of another Richard II, to where he's not a warlike prince, which is anathema to the whole scheme of the monarchy, which is just like, yeah, dude, our whole identity is based on war. That's why we haven't finished this war. This is a game. This is the world's best game, because we are so bored all the time. Which is just a fun thing I always think about, is just how much like weird things people got into. You kind of saw it during the pandemic of like, I've just become maniacally about baking bread. I've started war with France. Everybody has their coping mechanism. But we also have this whole conflict between the branches of the Valois, because a couple of decades beforehand, guy burns a man at a costume party. Then that man gets assassinated by his cousin, I think John the Bold of the Burgundy, because, he kind of drove the king's insanity worse that being the king who thought he was made of glass. I can't remember his name. I'm going to go with Charles.
It's one of the
That would have been
Charleses,
Charles the Sixth, right?
yes. I think
Yeah.
so.
Alexis. Oh
I'm
yeah,
pretty sure, yeah.
Oh, he's got some diagnoses going on. Let me tell you.
Yeah, because Charles
The
the
made of
Sixth
glass
saw his
thing is
brother
like
set
tip
a
of the
man
iceberg.
on fire at a costume party. Like, also they're pretty inbred, so not already a great gene pool. But Charles the Sixth, when he has to have a regency because of his struggles with his mental illness, his brother starts having an affair with the queen. His cousin kills his brother for doing that in public.
Like you do.
Yeah, and then that starts off a civil war and the 100 Years' War. So, Regency councils, not great for this time period.
Yeah, I can't remember. It may have been Garrett Manley's The Armada, but it could have been something else. I remember reading a history book once, and it's like there were two or three chapters just identifying all the Henrys in France, making sure you understood who all the Henrys were. And there were other, contestants to the throne as well. But just getting all your Henrys straight, was 3 chapters worth of exposition before you could even get into the history. And so,
I spent a half hour going through an alternative family line saying, what if Humphrey took over? And then eventually it leads into the Yorks. Do you know how many Henrys I had to count? Don that belongs to this real life family? 18. 18.
It's a lot of Henrys. And going back a little bit, just to pick on something that Eric said, this transitioning from medieval into sort of the modern nation state and what's there. We're before that. It's the formation. This is starting to rise, but we've talked here. We've used the word France multiple times here, and there was an understanding of who the French were, I guess, linguistically and culturally to a degree, but not like the way we use France today when we're talking about 21st century France in terms of it being a modern nation state. These were regions, these were areas that had been at various times independent or aligned with each other and changed over time, very much as the elements inside of the United Kingdom have changed over times in terms of whether they're the same place or not. And I think that's, to me, that's what makes it interesting is here's this, here's Joan, who we started off with here, who arrives on the scene. And again, things are so desperate. It's like, well, maybe she is seeing visions from God. We'll take a chance on this because that'll work as well as anything else. So where does this ultimately lead? No Joan of Arc. We said, basically the only people that would know would probably be 3 or 4 obscure historians who may have done some research on what happened before the loss at the Battle of Orleans. Again, she would be a footnote of history at best. One of the things I always think about here is, okay, if it wasn't her, maybe it's somebody else, right? Is there the possibility that somebody else similar to that steps up just because, that's what tends to happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's always possible, but it doesn't seem very plausible. And I think more than anything, Joan was it was a tonic, was a salve for the morale of the French troops. I'm going to pull a Bible quote here. I'm going to pull Romans 8:31. If God be for us, who can be against us? And I think that's that feels very much the way that the French forces reacted to Joan, believing, whether it's true or not, whether this is actually what happened or not, that she was picked by God to be to be his representative to the French forces. So if that fails, for whatever reason, then I think you don't have that morale boost, and I think you have a lack of direction, to what we would consider to be the French forces, and so I don't think you have a crowning of the Dauphin, at least not in the foreseeable future. And so I easily see the kind of the vision, and I think this is really more Henry V's vision, because again, Henry the Sixth is, I don't even know how old he is at this point. What is he, like 13 by this point or something like that?
I think he's 10.
10. Yeah. There you go. So he's a kid, so, he's probably not thinking of his, grand strategy for Northwestern Europe quite yet. But his father was, before, and so, we have sort of Henry V's vision for a a British Empire or Angevin Empire or English Empire, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, where, France, I think, has very much the same status as, what we would consider Scotland, Wales, has in our timeline. That they have their own culture. Certainly, they have their own language that has undergone a resurgence. But at the end of the day, they have internalized a lot of English culture, and that what they speak is English. And so, I think and then you have, again, we don't know what exactly happens to Burgundy. Maybe they persist to this day, and you have a Republic of Burgundy. That's an interesting, diversion that we could explore at a different point. That would be Republic of Burgundy would be a nice little, kind of wealthy republic, almost like a very large Luxembourg in many ways, potentially.
All that wine money.
And wine and finance. I feel like I could do a lot with Burgundy.
I feel like Burgundy would call itself France, and everybody else would call it Burgundy.
That's interesting. Well, or do they call themselves France and do what we would consider sort of the rump France? Would they call themselves something else? Because it's a lot of it's a lot of Provence. It's a lot of Aquitaine. It's a lot of other regions that are still things that we recognize today as France. But knowing that much like Germany, what we consider to be a cohesive culture is really not so much. I mean, maybe to externally to our American eyes and ears, it feels that way, but in many cases these are very disparate cultures, and so what we might end up with is a two French cultures that are politically different and are culturally somewhat different. And so anybody who's been to Austria will know that even though, yes, it is a German culture, but it's different. And I love Austria, by the way. Salzburg, one of my favorite cities on earth. But it's not, Salzburg is not Munich. It's not Berlin by a long shot. So these are very different.
One of the things you had posed, I appreciate that, Eric. One of the things you had posed, DC, in the timeline was, sort of leading into the things that would eventually become what I was thinking along the lines of the Reformation. But then even, the Reconquista is not that far ahead. Again, the Age of Discovery, 1492. It's easy for me to think of 1492 as Columbus sailing, but the other big event of that year was, the end of the Reconquista. The Moors are removed from Spain. And
Alhambra decree,
yeah. And one of the things that occurred to me, as I was thinking here through, you talk about all the Henrys there. You get Henry VI, Henry VII, Henry VIII. The decisions by the decision for Henry. Well, originally for Arthur. Originally for Arthur to marry Catherine. And then later becomes Henry marrying Catherine, and the set of dominoes, we all know what that goes down. And again, we visited there often on the podcast for the reasons that we have. That's a very different scenario. If you have a different France, you have different balance of power. You maybe have a different what's going on with Spain, where Spain's still dealing with its internal things versus the influence that it's trying to have on the rest of the continent. To me, there's just so many moving pieces. That's what I find very difficult about trying to go down the historical what if here, because you have a hard time figuring out in the equation what to turn into a constant to deal with the variables. There's just variables all over the place. Yeah. Robert, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say your butterfly effect at this point is multiple butterflies spinning off in multiple directions.
And how many of them are or how many of them are canceling each other's waves out versus, amplifying somebody else's and all of that. I think that's where it gets really, so often when we go down a historical alternate path, we sort of find one predominant path and we go down it and there's not as many influences that we think about. But here there's so many variables. I mean, it's just, this maybe changes nothing, or maybe it changes everything, I guess, is the way that I was thinking about it in my head, in terms of the long term of what's happening there. It's, if again, we're not even sure what to call these areas of France, whether they would call themselves France, is an interesting part of the equation of what's going on there. What else big did we miss?
Well, Zhang He does his final voyage for the Ming Dynasty before they impose a policy of isolation that will last until Britain starts selling them opium illegally.
Yeah. Well, I've often speculated about this. I'm thinking there about the Chinese maybe doing more to come, and and be more of a presence in the New World, if you will. But I've often wondered about if you have. We've talked about this before on a couple of other episodes. If you have a different England who is able to be more of an exploration power versus dealing with what they're dealing with for survival. What if it's not Spain that is the predominant influence in most of the New World? What if it is in England, or maybe it's the Portuguese, or maybe it's the Dutch? Dutch. I don't know who it is, but so much of the way that we think of how history goes down there for several hundreds of years is the wealth that was brought in by the Spanish riches coming in from the New World. What if it's not them? What if it's a more unified England who's not, and there's not as much of the Reformation as we know it. That's something that they're having to do there. Where this is an island nation. They were more geared towards maritime than they just didn't have the ability to do that as much because of what they were dealing with internally, politically, and externally politically.
Well, and then let's peek this just a little bit. Does England stay north if they go that exploration route? Or do they follow Spain's route and go south? Because I think that's and I'm thinking just because of navigational reasons, they end up staying north. And so do you have not 13 colonies right along the seaboard, but maybe 15 to 20 colonies that go to the other side of the Mississippi River and go down to Florida at that point as well?
I think they might have a little freer hand a bit south, but where do they sail from? So let's assume that they have the at least a part of an Atlantic coast of France that's available to them, and they're not just sailing from the English Channel, right? So the English Channel led them to Virginia and North Carolina initially, but led them to that part of the country. And so if they're a little bit to the south, does that really change a lot? I don't know.
Sure, they get Florida and Cuba in my mind.
Okay, yeah, I'll give you Florida at the very least, probably Cuba too. So at least they get a little bit more of a foothold, a little south, and a little bit in the Caribbean. But I don't know that it changes the distribution all that much. So I think you're Cuba. I think Cuba, Bahamas, and then pretty much the entire eastern seaboard.
And I hate to destroy the food people among us forever, but New Orleans does not exist as New Orleans as we know it, because the French never get it as Louisiana in this scenario, in my mind.
Yeah, that's right. No Louisiana, no Quebec.
Also, Joan of Arc goes down as Joan d'Arc in a Shakespeare play. That's what I've decided.
Maybe
Joan the Dark.
I think you just named the episode, Eric.
Joan d'Arc.
I don't know. I mean, does history totally forget her?
I think so. I think like Don said, at best she's a footnote, because she's the girl that showed up that managed to convince Charles to send supplies that did not help any.
Yeah, I think historians would know of her, because she comes and, the visions and offers to lead and all the other stuff that's there. But, pretty much you say, well, the visions must not have been true. She's dead. It's, problem solved or situation, there's success, and the success, as Eric sort of well pointed out, leads to, the confidence thing that happens there. It's a psychological impact. Maybe it is, a religious impact for those that believe. And, but if she's a one-day wonder, essentially, historians will know of her because the events would have happened and they were recorded, but she's not a figure. And, and then, even once she's captured by the English and tried and burned as a heretic, then she becomes a martyr. So, so her influence is true both when she's living and when she's dead.
Well, and one thing I found out when I was studying is that Charles VII had kind of soured on Joan of Arc because she kept getting in the way of him trying to do a truce with the Burgundian forces.
Yeah, it was kind of like, shut up, little peasant girl, and let me be the ruler.
He's like, there's only one king, and it's me. It's like a Children of the Corn situation between Malachi and that other dude that I can't remember his name of. But she also starts writing nobles letters saying, if I wasn't too busy killing the English, I'd be coming after you for your heresies against the church. And Charles is just like, please stop antagonizing my allies.
Yeah, I do remember reading things along the lines of, while she's valuable in the role that she takes on as a martyr, and obviously what she did there, at some point they're happier to have her gone than to have her around, because she's more trouble than she's worth in that respect.
She's good as a dead martyr. She's useless as a live peasant with visions. It is really because then she becomes a symbol of France.
And you can take that symbol and mold it to a degree how you want to when you're still in power. And that's always been the case for a lot of circumstances. So, it's I find her to be a fascinating, because even so, I've seen, well, I guess various Hollywood representations. The one that's in my mind, The Messenger, is the one that I have in my head. I can't pronounce her last name, but the first actress's first name is Mila. I remember that. But there's been a number of portrayals over the years. You see even how Hollywood portrays her differently, because she's this enigmatic character in history. Who she was, what she really was, what she might have been. All of that is really colored on which side you were on and how you thought about it and how you thought it through. But there's no doubt that I think that whether, I don't know, we're getting where with the alternate history so much, except that she was a turning point in real history. We know that if we take her out, the number of different things we've talked about here that could have been different are all possible. To Eric's original point, normally we talk about it when we talk about our forks, finding a plausible one. This is that interesting scenario where the reality seems less plausible than almost everything else we would mention or talk about. It's this rare thing where the thing that you wouldn't put the odds on is actually what happened. And now you're trying to figure out which of the other things which seems more probable, could have happened, which is harder to do because they all seem so probable.
Yep, we were prevented the glorious rise of parliamentary democracy across the continent. It almost seems fitting with Boris Johnson resigning from Parliament yesterday. That is Joan of Arc's greatest legacy. I don't know. That's a terrible joke. I'm so sorry.
Well, yeah, and ultimately they do become, when I think of the French monarchy, I immediately go to, the Sun King. I go to Louis XIV, and then ultimately go to Louis XVI in terms of, the way I think of French monarchy at two different stages there, sort of at its height and then right before its demise. And those are very different than the France that we're talking about here when Joan is, rescuing them and bringing them to prominence. It's quite a little rise they have after 1429.
So John Christophe Bonaparte is the head of Italy's Italian family in this timeline. No Bonapartes.
Yeah, good stuff. All right, I'm going to go around here real quick. Did we miss anything big that anybody just was thinking about they had to get out?
No.
Okay. Well, I do appreciate everybody here. Thank you, EC. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Lex. We're doing better. We're coordinating with each other to get to record on a regular basis, so you'll see us more frequently. We owe you guys that are Fork in Time listeners that also happen to be a Room Where It Happened listeners. We definitely owe you a Room Where It Happened. I know we have some ideas about where we're going to go there. I enjoyed last week's episode. Again, it's one of those things I've said all along. I'll just say it again because it's been a while. I didn't have to do anything for that episode last week except listen to those guys who pulled the episode together, and that was a fun place to be. And Dylan and EC and the others that were part of that, Robert, were part of that. I appreciate you guys doing that. So we want to thank our listeners for being patient. Stick with us. We're worth sticking with. We got so many topics in the queue. It's unbelievable. It's just finding the time to get them done. So we just have to be better about not letting our real lives get in the way. The thing that we wish we were all just multi-billionaires so we could do this all the time and not have to really work for a living. But I haven't quite made it there yet. I was talking to somebody yesterday. I was thinking of the episode with that Chris and I guess Eric, you did too, which was the SpaceX episode, the Elon Musk episode. I was talking about using Chris's analogy of Elon really is he's a Bond villain with the spaceships and everything, kind of thing. And so where'd you get that from? I said I stole that from one of the guys that's on our podcast team, but so I'll give Chris credit for that since he's not able to join us here today. Anybody have any closing thoughts before I close this out for good? All right. Alexa, I'm going
to each other.
Yeah. I think that's our fifth 1980s movie reference. We've gotten Better Off Dead in off podcast. We got in a certain Spielberg film that shall remain nameless. We've gotten in a couple of other things here. So good stuff. Yeah, be excellent to each other. So Lex, since you're on today's recording, I'm going to throw it to you with our traditional close. Any suggestion for what our listeners ought to do if they encounter a fork in time?
Take it.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.